And so the wheel turns, and Jessie finally gets done with this book. Hello, interwebs, and yes, I have finally read the third book in the Wheel of Time series, The Dragon Reborn. And I want to say right up front, I am sorry that this took me so long to get to this book. I know it's been a hot minute since I did the review of The Great Hunt, the second book in the series, but I've been so busy. There's been other books that I want to read. I've been editing a lot of stuff, so I apologize this kind of fell by the wayside, but I did finally get back onto it, and I promise to try to be a little bit more regular with my reviews of these books going forward. We'll see if I stick to that, but I promise I will get through all of them because I've been enjoying them so far. And just to catch all of you up who may be jumping into this video for the first time, I am someone who joined the Wheel of Time fandom after watching the show. Saw the first season, generally liked it, had my issues with it, but generally liked it, but didn't have any knowledge of the books, and now I've been going through and reading the first, second, and now the third book in the saga, and will be reading the rest of them. So this is my thoughts just on having read the third book and knowing nothing of the rest of the books in the series. So with that introduction out of the way, let's actually talk about the book. And by the way, I'm going to go full spoilers on this book. So if you have not read the book and don't want any spoilers, no, I'm going to go full into it here. But overview thoughts on this before I get into the nitty-gritty. I generally enjoyed this book, but I do think that it is my least favorite of the 3 books that I have read so far. And that is probably going to be a little bit controversial, I guess, because sort of looking out into the fandom after I read this book, I just sort of got like a little taste of where this book sits within everyone's thoughts. And I think that this book is generally regarded very highly, and I liked it overall, but this is generally considered to be even better than the other 2 that I've read sometimes on some people's lists, though The Great Hunt probably sometimes rated a little bit higher. But for me, I think this is actually the worst, even not as good as the first book in the series. And I think that that's for a myriad of different reasons that I'll get into. But what I will say for this book up front, and what I'll give it points for over the first book in the series, which was a more standard-esque token sort of take on the fantasy genre, this book takes a lot of different risks and starts to blow up a lot more of that sort of token-esque fantasy narrative that we saw in the first book, a little less in the second book, but definitely here, this breaks it up entirely. Namely to do with the fact that we are distanced from Rand, our kind of essentially main protagonist of the series so far, for pretty much the entirety of this book. Right at the start of the book, he sort of has this feeling of like, I'm the Dragon Reborn, oh crap, I don't know what to do, I don't feel like I'm good enough. He like fails to save some people during an attack on this base with all these people that are sort of looking up to him as the Dragon Reborn, and he just decides to force the prophecy by running off to find Kalendor, the sword that sort of is supposed to signal that the Dragon Reborn is here and sort of get everyone to sort of rally around him in the fight against the Dark One. And we spend most of the book just after he leaves, not getting to see much of him, and the little bits that we do see are actually kind of freaky. And I loved, again, the subtle horror of the series, like the moments that we see Rand here, where he's kind of freaking out and kind of going mad a little bit, possibly from the taint of his magic, but also more from just like feeling the weight and isolation and fear of all the expectations that he's sort of feeling around him. And then also the moments where he like raises up the dead to bow to him, and he just gets all this power. I loved that stuff because it was just so creepy to be so distant from him and so sort of looking outside at like all this stuff that he's feeling and how that must look to the people that care around him. Some of the moments where Night and Eve sort of goes to the dream world and sees him and sees that stuff, it's honestly kind of heartbreaking and scary. And I thought it was very well depicted here. Speaking of which, since I sort of mentioned it before I get into the other stuff, the dream world and the building out of lore and how this world works, I really just love. I love how in each book so far that Jordan has constantly added like complications to the lore and just made it more complex. The first book had things like the ways and sort of the standard sort of magic system that was sort of gendered. But then the second book evolved it even more, where we got parallel universes and the ability to travel with these stones. And then in the third book now we're getting the dream magic, where we get to see that the dream world is a thing, and we kind of see these sort of things in other fantasy works as well, where it's like, oh, people get prophecies and sort of see the future and get to like see other elements of things and get sort of notes and messages from that. But Jordan takes that and codifies it within this magic system and being like, oh, the dream world is an actual thing that people know, and it can actually influence our real world. And so the dream world is a thing that only some people can get access to for a long period of time. Everyone can kind of see it to a degree, but people like Perrin and Night and Eve can actually influence it a little bit more than other people. And I just really loved that he takes these fantasy tropes, more codifies them, and directly pulls them into his world, making his world ultimately more complex and yet solidified at the same time. And I really just appreciated that, and I hope that that continues as the book goes, to just keep getting more and more and more and more complex with his magic systems and adding more of the stuff that sort of draws upon fantasy, but makes it more literal in terms of how it's used in in this series. But then this gets us to some of the characterization of our characters, and some of these I'm a little bit more hit or miss on. I'll start with Perrin. I really loved everything with Perrin. Perrin is easily one of my favorite characters. I love seeing his very strong moral stances, because he goes after Rand, and as we sort of see, he just encounters all these different events, sort of crazy things happening behind Rand, because he is sort of able to influence events, because he is Taviran and can sort of change things. Perrin, we get to see him dealing with these moral stances and the worries that he has, being someone who is like a wolf walker. I forget what the ability is actually called, but him seeing like other people that transform into wolves, and but also him like wanting to release people out into the world, which comes like a recurring theme to him, like him freeing people. However, I do find some of this storyline and the way that this was written a little bit reiterative at times and taking a long time to get to the point. And I can already see here why Jordan, especially towards the middle of the series, might get a little bit of a reputation as being a little bit long in the tooth, because I do think that there are some sections of the pacing with Perrin stories that just kind of drag for me. And I was just sort of like, okay, let's get to it. Let's go. And so I just thought that it was just taking its time. And I worry, because knowing that like things like I hear the slog comes up at some point, that this is just a problem of pacing that gets drawn more and more out with Jordan as we continue to go. So bit concerned on that front. And then I also didn't like that there was this girl who was like just very into Perrin. Maybe she'll be interesting as the book goes forward, but her introduction here is very much like, oh, I'm very interested in Perrin. I'm like, oh, good, a girl who's just freaking out of the hero, because that feels a little bit like a outdated writing of women. And speaking of outdated writing of women, I didn't particularly love Night and Eve in this book. Egwene I'm a little bit better on, but Night and Eve especially I thought was particularly just kind of frustrating. And I know she's sort of got, what's the best way to put it? Anger issues, I guess. That's probably not the best way, but she is a bit like more of a distance and sort of like staunch in her point of view. But at one point where she is rescued by Matt at the end, I think she treated him like kind of like a jerk, and she just throughout the book just feels a little bit much. That being said, the politics with some of the Aes Sedai was great, but again, also kind of dragged a little bit for me, because we have the Amaryllis Sea tasking Night and Eve and Egwene, and also some of the other folks, to look for the Black Aja and figure out who they are, and ultimately it just kind of gets kind of stuck in the middle of just cycling through all these characters and getting us to know these characters and accusing other people and not really being sure, and ultimately doesn't really go anywhere within this book. And then we kind of get a reiteration of what happened last book, where the girls get kidnapped and captured and have to be rescued by the guys, this time Matt, at the end of the book, which is sort of what happened at the end of book 2. And I'm like, I really hope this doesn't get a pattern with Jordan where like girls do some things, then they get captured and have to be rescued by the dudes at the end of the book, because that constantly is a recurring theme. So far, it's happened twice, and I'm bit disliking that, especially for how strongly written these women are within the books. Despite my sort of problems with them here and there and some of their characterization, they are very strongly written women, and that's unique, especially for the time within fantasy that Jordan was writing in, so I'm praised for that, but less so with how they're utilized within the plot. So that I found a tad frustrating. However, the strongest storyline here that I really loved was Matt. I loved Matt finally becoming like a character in this book, because the past few books he's been sort of stuck with like the dagger stuff and like being corrupted by it. Here though, finally he actually starts to get some characterization, and he kind of becomes that like roguish guy who's like, I'm here in it for myself. I don't want to get involved in anything. I'll sort of run away, take care of myself. Everyone else is just weird and strange, and I don't want any part of that. But then having to get drawn back into it, because he ultimately is a good guy who cares about people and wants to save his friends, and also gets wrapped up in this sort of like palace intrigue with dark friends trying to kill the princess, the queen's daughter, and all of that stuff. And so I thought all of that was just like showed that he is that sort of rogue with the heart of gold, and I really just enjoyed it. But I also really loved the development of Jordan codifying some fantasy tropes with his characters, because we get that Matt has the ability to, if he does things randomly, he can get a lot of good luck. He basically has like a luck power. And so if he like randomly walks into inns, he can find the person that he's looking for. If he can win at gambling, as long as it's random and it's not like strategy or anything like that, he can just randomly choose to do stuff, which I like may sound like a convenient thing for fantasy. Like, oh, you have a character who can just luck into anything you want. So that can be like a get out of jail free card for the writer to just have his characters luck out of stuff. But I actually really liked how it's depicted here because it takes like Matt having to actually think about it and actually realize and come to understand, oh, this is how this power works. And that like discovery was so cool to read. And again, it kind of builds off of that problem in other fantasy literature where we do have characters who just seem to have luck come out of nowhere. And so it's like, oh, Jordan taking these tropes and making them part of the magic system that he is displaying within here, and actually sort of making it literal instead of it just being kind of a convenient storytelling device that maybe other writers would use within their story. And so I loved that. I thought that that was really cool. We'll see how it develops. It could ultimately still fall into that like convenient trope of like the character getting to do anything that he wants to because he's lucky. So that might be a problem down the line, but here in this book, I think it worked really, really well, and I think it fits Matt's character as well. Like it's a power that fits him as a character really well. All this leads to the epic finale, which again feels a little bit reiterative of the past two books where we have our characters sort of come together and face this big menace in the sky. And it was well written, it was very engaging, a big great final fight with who we ultimately learn is Ishmael, not the Dark One himself, though he was the sort of man taunting Rand the entire book, and so we thought that he is Beelzebub, which then makes me think back to the actual show, The Wheel of Time, because it was sort of implied that that was the Dark One in the season finale of that show. I'm like, oh, is that Ishmael? A lot of people were telling me that. I'm like, oh, I see what they were doing in the finale of that show now. But anyways, regardless, I liked the big battle, but again, it felt a little bit reiterative of what we had seen in book 2. However, I liked that it ended on this note of like, oh, the fight has just begun. That we have our characters get together, they fight the bad guy, Rand beats him, and it's like, no, that wasn't the Dark Friend. That was just one dude. Maybe one of his stronger servants, sure, but it was not the Dark One, and all this chaos has even happened, and the Dark One's not even free yet. Like, that was a good, ominous sort of note to end this book on. And I'm like, oh, has me very excited to go into future books in the series. So, on the whole, what I will say with this book is it's still very, very strong. I can see why people love this book. However, I am starting to get some of the negatives here with mainly the pacing, and still some of the frustrating sort of recurring utilizations of plot of like with the women and the sort of big battle at the end that brings all their characters together. Some of these like recurring like same plot beats and also just pacing issues I think are some of the things that drag it down for me. But on the whole, still a very strong book with strong characters, some bold choices like distancing us from Rand, and some great development of less so the world, more so these magic systems and codifying some fantasy tropes within this. So I was really pleased with this book. I'm still excited to continue the show, and the book, I guess I should say. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, I'm going to say I am also going to continue reviewing this book series, but I am going to get back to reading the Discworld books because the reason I was waiting on those books to review is not that I didn't have time for those, but actually because they were releasing new audiobooks for the Discworld books, and I was actually kind of like waiting to get the new audiobooks because I like reading stuff through audiobooks. So I will be getting back to the Discworld reviews as well, but I was just waiting for those, and now they're out, so I'm excited to listen to the new audiobooks that have come out for that series, the updated ones. But yeah, I will be reviewing both of those series going forward, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this book down below. What did you think of The Dragon Reborn? But beyond all of that, thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.